I'm beaming in from Australia, Sydney. I'm sitting on the land of the Indigenous people, the Warimba Nation, and I pay tribute to the elders past and present of the land that I'm on here in Australia. I wanted to talk with you about responsible innovation and how artificial intelligence is presenting both challenges and opportunities as we try and make sure that technology works for us, that it delivers us the future that we want and need, and not the one that we fear. And I'm speaking to you from a new role. Up until 3 months ago, I was Australia's Human Rights Commissioner, where I undertook a major project which looked at the human rights implications of the rise of AI. And we took a really balanced view. We could see that AI is presenting enormous opportunities. Most obvious, those opportunities are economic and financial. There are also opportunities to connect us better as communities. But there are some very specific human rights opportunities as well, in terms of making sure that we're more inclusive, particularly for people with disability. But as Human Rights Commissioner, it is my melancholy duty to focus also on the risks and threats of harm. And we found that those risks and threats were real, and they perhaps hadn't been considered deeply enough. And so in this presentation, what I'd like to do is try and kind of replicate that balanced approach. So draw attention to what we consider to be really exciting about the rise of AI, but also the risks and threats that need to be accommodated and addressed. And then finally, a way forward that will really take us towards a future that we can all be genuinely excited about and also feel is going to be safe. So I want to start by talking about machine learning, because the term artificial intelligence is not a term of art. It's really a term that draws together a range of technologies and techniques. But perhaps the most important of those from our human rights perspective is machine learning, because machine learning, perhaps more than any other technology or technique, is really driving major change in the way in which decisions are made. So perhaps I can illustrate that by telling you or reminding us about what life was like before the rise of machine learning. So if you take as a hypothetical example, a bank. If the bank was trying to make home loan decisions 20 or so years ago, it would, for any individual application for a home loan, it would start with a big morass of paper, almost a chaotic morass of paper, as the picture on your screen now illustrates. And from that, they'd try and make some data-driven decisions, but it was very, very difficult in big organizations, both in government and in the private sector, to make sense of all of the data that the organization held. And so any decision would be a mixture of some data-driven elements, but also just practices the organization had built up over time, some heuristics, and some out and out prejudice. And so that would be the foundation of most big decisions. What machine learning has done, and other elements of AI, has been to put that information into, in a metaphorical sense, nice, neat piles. You can't make data-driven decisions unless you have your data all kind of ordered in a way that you can make sense of it. And so one of the most exciting kind of aspects of the rise of AI is, for the first time, machine learning and massive increases in computing power have allowed us to make more data-driven decisions. And so perhaps what we can look at now is how that works in practice, because I think that draws attention to both one of the greatest strengths of machine learning for improving decision making, but also one of its biggest weaknesses. So I came across this cartoon just recently and I really, really like it. So I'm sharing it with you. What machine learning does is it relies on previous decisions. So in that home loan example, you'd find as many previous decisions that the bank has made. You put it through your AI-powered computer, and you in a sense teach it what are the characteristics of good customers and what are the characteristics of bad customers. So going to this cartoon that you can see before you, you start with data, you give that data some meaning, and that gives you information. Over time, you can actually build knowledge. That's when those neat piles of paper start to arise. One of the most exciting things about machine learning is insights. And those insights really come from correlations. So what I was talking about before in the home loan example is when you start to correlate particular characteristics with people who turned out to be good customers, and similarly, particular characteristics with people who turned out to be bad customers. And so those correlations is where you have insights. And when the system works really well, you have wisdom. You can draw a link, so you can understand why one particular characteristics makes someone a good or a bad customer. So that's where the system works well. The problem is that not all correlations are meaningful. Many correlations are white noise. And so you can just as easily end up in the bottom right-hand corner of the cartoon, not with wisdom, but rather with your machine learning system misfiring. And you can have error or some kind of incorrect view of the world. And we've seen that many times in a range of decision-making contexts. I'll come back to that in a moment. Really, when we talk about the rise of AI, the opportunities are obvious, and I've already kind of alluded to those. But what are the things that we should be worried about? Because unless we get to grips with those things that we should be concerned about, then the really exciting positive potential of AI will not be realized. The first is equality. So sticking with my home loan example, when you're teaching your AI-powered system what makes a good customer or a bad customer, I said that you have to start with training data, so you find as many previous decisions as possible. What we've found with banks and financial services organizations around the world is that older data, particularly data from the 80s and 90s, which is still being used to train these systems, carries with it bias that is very problematic. So a good example is that we have made real progress towards gender equality in the last 30 or 40 years. But if you were a woman applying for a bank loan in the 1980s or 1990s, in most countries, it would have been much more difficult to get that loan than it is today. Similarly, we've seen racial biases as well creep into the data. Now, the problem with a machine learning system can be that unless you're alive to that issue, then it can be like a zombie where you're reawakening an old form of discrimination, because your machine learning system has learned from those old decisions where it was less likely for women to be granted home loans. So one of the most fundamental issues that was right at the center of our work at the Australian Human Rights Commission was this challenge to equality that machine learning can sometimes present. The second problem is one of accountability. So we've seen how what has become known as black box AI systems can make it very difficult to maintain some level of oversight over the operation of that system. So again, working with my example of the home loan, imagine you're a woman, you apply for a bank loan and your application is rejected. You're then left with an unsettling feeling. Is it because I just was not a good customer that my home loan application was rejected? Or if you're a woman, is it because I'm a woman that my home loan application was rejected? Now, our systems of democratic accountability require that question be able to be tested. And so that ultimately we're able to take to a court of law any allegation that you have not been treated fairly, and certainly if you've been treated in a discriminatory way. The problem with many AI systems is that if all of the decision making happens in a black box, and all the company can do at the endpoint is say, well, look, you've been rejected for this home loan because that's what the computer says, then you can never get to the bottom of whether the rejection was fair and reasonable, or whether it was unfair and potentially unlawful. And so one of the big challenges, I think, in moving from first generation AI to the next generation of artificial intelligence is to ensure that we are able to maintain systems of accountability, so that you're able to challenge a decision that is unlawful or unfair. And then finally, I think we're well aware of the risk to privacy. So when we were consulting people in Australia and around the world, what people said over and over to us was, it's not some abstract concern about living a more private life. It's a concern about having your personal information used against you. And I think that's actually a really profound concern that we picked up from the community, because we work really closely with human rights commissions around the world and other partners. And we're all starting to hear, I think, a similar message, which is that concerns about privacy are partly about, choosing to the extent to which you want to live a life in the public layer, but it's also about making sure that your personal information is not used to harm you. And so that's something that has to be right at the center of how you develop and use AI. And so to round off this part of the discussion, just a few examples that I've kind of flashed up on the screen now of where we're starting over the last couple of years to see how these AI systems can misfire and cause discrimination to people on the basis of their race or of their gender and other characteristics. And the example I've given has been from the banking sector. But really, I don't want to kind of suggest that banking is more likely to lead to a misfire of AI, because in reality, we can see these problems arise wherever AI is used. And so what's the lesson from this? Well, I think companies really have a choice as to how they can proceed. And that choice really boils down to three pathways. The first, and this is the pathway that I'm most worried about, is where companies are just utterly cavalier. That's perhaps summed up best by the quotation from Mark Zuckerberg, which is just move fast and break things. I think when you're operating in an area that really matters, where you can really affect people's basic rights, then that cavalier approach is unacceptable. We need to move past an approach where we just iterate as we go, no matter what harm might be caused along the way. So that's the first pathway. The second pathway, in a sense, is understandable, but can be equally problematic. What we saw a lot over the last couple of years was companies saying, well, look, as we've become aware, not just of the opportunities of AI, but the risks, we've decided that the whole thing should be kind of avoided. It's the mindset that says we throw out all of our computers and we dust off the abacus and we just use old technology. I think that is, in a sense, just as problematic, because we know that the old ways of making decisions were not particularly data-driven and carried with them many, many problems. And so just putting your head in the sand and saying, I'm not going to use AI, I don't think that is an appropriate response either. And so that brings me to the third pathway, which I think is the best and most appropriate pathway. And that is to take a really mindful approach to the way in which you use AI, to understand enough about the technology and how it's going to work with your organization, that you can set a really good strategy, and that you can then implement that strategy really effectively, so that you can kind of get all the financial and economic benefits from AI, but you can also make sure that your customers are effectively protected. So that brings me to my last really important point, which is about the skills we're going to need going forward. It's often said that there is worldwide a major skills gap or skills shortage when it comes to artificial intelligence. And that's certainly true. The problem is when we talk about this AI skills gap, we only look at it from one facet. So let me explain what I mean by that. We talk a lot about an AI skills gap in technical skills. By that, we really mean we're not producing enough people with a data science or other STEM background, which will be necessary in order to ensure that we can build from a technical sense the AI that there is demand for. Worldwide, there's no official data on precisely how big that gap is. The estimates range from about 300,000 people shortage in the technical skills to several million. I think it's probably much more likely to be in the millions of people who we need to fill that skills gap, because just on the metric of unfilled jobs in AI, that's in the millions right today. Here where I am in Australia, the gap is projected by the end of this decade to be somewhere between 70 and 80,000 people in terms of those technical skills. Now, there is lots of work being done in major universities and other technical institutions worldwide to address that skills gap, and that's really important work. But the argument I want to make to you is that there's another gap which is just as important and that there's not nearly enough focus on. And that's what we are calling the AI strategic skills gap, as distinct from the AI technical skills gap. Let me explain to you what I mean by the problem that I'm referring to. What we're finding, and the research on this is really clear, is that the vast majority of organizations are either already using artificial intelligence or they have concrete plans to do so. About 3/4 of organizations worldwide are in that category. The problem is that the vast majority of those organizations don't feel capable of even setting an appropriate strategy when it comes to AI. So less than 1/4 of company boards feel that they understand artificial intelligence enough to set a strategy. And so that combination, I think, is really worrying. And that's how you end up with probably my most worrying statistic, which is that about 85% of all projects that use artificial intelligence fail. So let me be clear about that. I'm not talking about failure in the lab, which doesn't matter so much. I mean failure in real life. I can't find any other area of human activity where we would accept such a high failure rate. And to be clear, I don't think that the problem lies primarily with the tech companies which are at the heart of building this technology. I mean, there's work that they can do as well, of course. But one of the big problems is at the strategic side. So if you're a company or you're a government agency and you're not capable of setting a good strategy when it comes to AI, you're likely to have major problems. And what we're also finding is at the next layer down, where companies are procuring AI tools and then implementing them or integrating into their own operations, there's another layer of problem. And we're finding that, again, that companies and government agencies often don't have the basic skills that they need to run an effective procurement process and then to ensure that the AI tool that they've just bought is going to work effectively and safely in their organization. So what is the way forward? Well, most people listening into this discussion will be aware of the old fable of the hare and the tortoise. What I think has been right at the center of the rise of new technology is the idea that you kind of proceed at breakneck speed It doesn't matter if you fail many times as you go, because eventually you'll get it right. And there are some areas for which that is true. But the old story of the hare and the tortoise is one that I think we need to remind ourselves of, because what we've found over and over again in our work in this area is that sometimes if you do try and proceed at breakneck speed and you keep on making mistakes as you go, it can be much harder to design an AI system that's really going to work. And overall, it takes you much longer. By contrast, the tortoise, which proceeds reasonably slowly, but very methodically in running its race, can actually win the race when it takes an approach that is much less likely to lead it down blind alleys, to take the wrong path, to cause harm as it goes, which then has to be fixed, but rather takes a really good design-led approach. So at the Human Rights Commission, we tried to outline in great detail what that looks like. And if you want to see the long version of that, you can go to tech.humanrights.gov.au to see a more detailed analysis. But the last thing I'll say is just a summary of what I mean by that approach. Essentially, what we would describe as a responsible innovation approach to AI starts with really good design. So working my way across this slide, you start by making sure that in the tools or the systems that are procured, usually from tech companies, you really are very clear on what your intentions are, and you're really clear in bringing together all of the people who'll be affected, so that they can make sure that in designing the tool, there's a really effective way of drawing to the surface all of the most important issues that need to be considered. And so spending a bit more time in having a really rigorous design process may keep you in the lab a little bit longer, but it will also make sure that what you actually put into practice later on is much more robust. And so then thinking about deployment, a lot of this, of course, happens in the lab, not in the real world, or it should. And so what we've tried to isolate in the designing algorithms, training data, and I guess addressing what an effective output of an AI system might look like, is that iterative process where you've got the various different perspectives brought to bear, but that at least initially that happens in the lab, rather than immediately putting that out into the real world where harm can be very difficult to undo. And then, of course, the final stage, which is implementation, that is really important, because if an AI system is working in the way that it is intended, it will change or adapt over time. And so you need really effective oversight mechanisms to make sure that as your system adapts, even if on day one you're absolutely confident that it was working as well as it possibly could and was not going to cause harm, that you can have oversight to make sure that you see if it starts to go off the rails. And if you can have effective oversight in the implementation stage, then you can continue to adjust the system to make sure that it improves over time without causing harm. So the final slide it just has my contact details on the screen right now. And so if you're wanting to follow the work that I'm leading at the University of Technology here in Sydney, you'd be welcome to do so, or to get in touch with me directly. But really, the last point I want to make is this. From a human rights perspective, there is such enormous positive potential when it comes to the rise of artificial intelligence, and particularly techniques and technologies like machine learning. That potential can be realized, but only if we take what I consider to be a more mindful approach to the way in which we approach strategize, then design, develop and use AI. And that requires, I think, two things. One, a really strong understanding of what some of the risks and threats are that we need to overcome. And then secondly, a really methodical approach to how we're going to strategize, design, develop, and then use AI. Thank you very much for listening to me.